All right, so let's dive into this whole future of work thing, especially what hybrid work might look like in 2025.
Yeah.
The sources we've got here paint a really interesting picture. It's almost like
Hmm.
a tug of war,
Yeah.
between companies wanting people back in the office and the reality that a lot of us actually like these hybrid setups.
Right.
We've got everything from Amazon's full return to office policy to British Telecom's more balanced approach.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
It is wild, and what I'm really curious about is whether companies pushing for a full return might end up hurting themselves, in the long run.
It's a fascinating tension we're seeing.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, just a few years ago, the world went remote practically overnight. And now
Right.
it's almost like the pendulum is swinging back, especially with these major U.S. corporations like Amazon, UPS, Salesforce, Dell,
Oh, yeah.
Starbucks. They're all calling their employees back in.
It feels like every week there's another headline about some company tightening their remote work policy.
Yeah.
But why now?
Oh.
What's driving this big shift back to the office?
Well, if you look at Amazon CEO Andy Jassy's decision,
Okay.
by the way, to require everyone back in the office 5 days a week,
Wow.
starting January 2nd.
Yeah.
He's putting a huge emphasis on in-person collaboration.
Okay.
He really believes it's crucial for innovation and that kind of creative spark that you just can't replicate online.
Yeah.
So for them, at least, it seems less about control and more about a deeply held belief in the power of face-to-face interaction.
That's interesting, but couldn't that also be a risky move, especially when so much research points to hybrid workers being the most satisfied?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't forcing them back full-time risk alienating them and maybe even losing them to companies with more flexible options?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because even though we're seeing this push for a return to the office, it's not a complete reversal everywhere.
Okay.
Plenty of companies, even in the U.S., are implementing these RTO policies, return to office.
Right.
But with a twist, they're still allowing for 1 or 2 days of remote work each week.
Okay. So it's not an all-or-nothing situation.
Right.
Are there any good examples of companies getting this balance right?
British Telecom's 3 together to wherever policy is a good one.
Okay.
It's pretty straightforward. 3 days in the office, 2
Yeah.
wherever you want.
I like that.
They seem to be acknowledging the benefits of both in-person and flexible work.
It feels like a good compromise. Are other companies taking similar approaches, or are there more out there solutions?
Well, PwC is doing something a little different.
Hmm.
They're using location tracking to ensure their employees are either in the office or at client sites for at least 3 days a week.
Wow.
So there's definitely some variety in how companies are tackling this.
It makes you wonder if all this variety points to some deeper tension, right? Like,
Yeah.
are companies truly prioritizing employee satisfaction, or are they just trying to find the most cost-effective way to get people back in the building?
That's a really important question, and one that I think we'll be grappling with for a while, especially when you consider the research highlighting how crucial hybrid models are for attracting and retaining top talent.
Right.
Harvard economists are even saying it's become a key factor in today's competitive job market.
So if companies are smart, they'll figure out a way to offer flexibility without sacrificing collaboration.
Right.
But isn't there also an argument that some things are just better done in person? Like, you can't brainstorm a new marketing campaign or mentor a junior colleague as effectively over Zoom, can you?
That's the other side of the coin, isn't it?
Right.
There's definitely a valid argument to be made for the spontaneous creativity and deeper connections that can happen when people are physically together.
Yeah.
And to be fair, some experts do believe that in-person presence is simply irreplaceable for certain activities.
So where does that leave us? It seems like there are good arguments on both sides.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, there are companies like Avery Morgan at Eddie who are sounding the alarm,
Uh-oh.
warning that these strict RTO policies could completely backfire.
Okay.
He argues that they could actually lead to increased employee dissatisfaction,
Oh, wow.
potentially driving top talent to competitors offering more flexibility.
Really?
In the end, he suggests it could damage company culture and performance.
So are companies just shooting themselves in the foot by trying to force everyone back to the old way of doing things?
It's a possibility.
Are they going to end up with a bunch of unhappy, less productive employees?
That's a possibility, especially if they aren't careful. And to highlight that even further, let's take a look at what's happening in the finance sector.
Okay.
JP Morgan Chase & Co., for example, is getting ready to require a full return to the office,
Really?
following similar moves by Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, HSBC, and Barclays.
Wow.
It's almost like they're bucking the trend completely.
So it's not just about individual companies. It might be about entire industries taking different approaches. That's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But before we get too overwhelmed, maybe we should break down the potential downsides of this office comeback. After all, it can't be all sunshine and roses, right?
You're absolutely right. There are some valid concerns that need to be addressed. So let's shift gears and take a closer look at the potential risks of a full-scale return to the office.
Yeah, let's unpack some of those potential downsides because,
Good.
as you said, it's not all going to be smooth sailing for everyone.
Right. We were just talking about how hybrid workers tend to report the highest levels of satisfaction.
Right.
What happens to that satisfaction if you suddenly yank that flexibility away?
That's a huge concern. Forcing those employees back into the office full time could lead to a pretty significant drop in morale. And it's not just about the commute either.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the traffic headaches, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Absolutely. Think about the impact on work-life balance. Many employees have built their lives around this flexibility,
Mhm.
managing childcare errands, appointments,
Right.
things that are much harder to juggle when you're tied to a 9 to 5 office schedule.
It's like we've had this glimpse of a different way of working, and now some companies are trying to stuff the genie back in the bottle.
But hasn't that genie already granted some pretty significant wishes?
Exactly. And for certain demographics, like working parents or those with caregiving responsibilities, that flexibility isn't just a perk,
Right.
it's a necessity. If companies aren't sensitive to those needs, they risk alienating a large portion of their workforce.
And let's not forget the financial burden.
Oh, yeah?
Commuting costs childcare expenses, maybe even needing to buy a whole new office wardrobe.
Yeah.
Those costs can add up really quickly, especially with inflation the way it is.
It's a valid point. For some employees, a full return to the office could actually mean a decrease in their take-home pay, even if their salary stays the same.
That's almost counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
You'd think going back to the office would mean higher productivity, more opportunities, maybe even bigger bonuses down the line. But if you're constantly stressed about making ends meet, can you really be fully engaged at work?
That's a great point. And speaking of productivity, there's actually research suggesting that many employees have become more productive working remotely. They've found their groove, established their routines, and figured out how to maximize their output in a way that just might not translate back to a traditional office setting.
It's almost like saying, hey, you've spent the last few years optimizing your workflow, and now we're going to disrupt all of that and expect you to be just as efficient, if not more so, in an environment that might not actually be conducive to your best work.
Right.
Doesn't really make sense, does it?
Not really.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the idea that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might be a productivity killer for another. Companies need to recognize that individual needs and preferences play a huge role in how people work best.
So are you saying companies are being too rigid in their approach?
It's a real concern. If they push these RTO policies without considering the individual needs of their employees, they're basically setting themselves up for failure. They'll create a culture of resentment, distrust, and ultimately they'll lose their best people to companies who are willing to offer a more flexible and supportive environment.
And remember, Avery Morgan's warning the one about companies losing their best employees to competitors because of these strict RTO policies?
Right.
This is exactly what he's talking about.
He's spot on. Flexibility is a huge draw in today's job market. It's not just a nice to have, it's a core expectation. For many job seekers, especially those who've experienced the benefits of hybrid work firsthand.
So companies are facing a real dilemma, aren't they? They want the collaboration and innovation that comes with in-person work, but they also need to attract and retain top talent in a world that's increasingly embracing flexibility. It's a tough balancing act.
Absolutely. But there are ways to navigate this successfully. Open communication and transparency are key. Companies need to be upfront with their employees about their plans, solicit feedback, and be willing to adjust their policies based on what they hear.
So what does this mean for the average person out there listening to this? What advice would you give them as they try to navigate this whole evolving work landscape?
Well, I'd say the first thing is to be your own advocate. Don't be afraid to voice your needs and preferences to your employer. If a full return to the office just isn't feasible for you, you say so.
And what if they're not receptive? Should people be looking for new jobs with companies that are more aligned with their values and needs?
It's definitely something to consider.
Huh.
Do your research, look for companies that prioritize flexibility and have a track record of supporting hybrid work arrangements.
It's like, don't settle for a job that makes you miserable just because it's the traditional way of doing things.
Right.
The world is changing, and there are companies out there who are changing with it.
Exactly. And stay informed. Read articles, listen to podcasts, stay up to date on industry trends and best practices. The world of work is in constant flux, and being proactive about your career is more important than ever.
But what if your company isn't open to change? What can you do then?
That's where collective action comes in. Talk to your colleagues, see if there's a shared desire for more flexibility. Maybe there are ways to work together to advocate for changes within your organization.
Like forming a union or an employee resource group.
Exactly. There's power in numbers, and sometimes it takes a collective voice to push for meaningful change.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think the key takeaway for our listeners is this.
Yeah.
You have a choice. You don't have to passively accept whatever your company decides. You can be an active participant in shaping your work life and advocating for what you need to thrive.
And remember, this whole conversation about the future of work is still unfolding. It's a period of experimentation and adjustment for both companies and employees. What we're seeing now are just snapshots of a much larger story that's still being written.
And it's a story that we can all help write, isn't it? Through our choices, our actions, and our willingness to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. The future of work is what we make it.
Hmm.
So let's create something innovative, adaptable, and ultimately something that works for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential downsides of a full return to the office, but I think it's only fair to explore the other side of the coin.
Right.
After all, there must be some legitimate reasons why companies are so keen on getting everyone back under one roof, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the potential downsides, but there are definitely valid arguments in favor of in-person collaboration.
Okay, so put on your devil's advocate hat for a minute. Convince me why going back to the office might not be such a bad thing.
Well, think about those spontaneous interactions we were talking about earlier. Those water cooler moments
Right.
that spark new ideas and collaborations. You just don't get that same level of serendipity in a virtual environment.
I see your point. It's like sometimes the best ideas come when you're not even trying, right? You bump into a colleague in the hallway, strike up a conversation, and boom, you're onto something groundbreaking.
Exactly. And it's not just about brainstorming either.
Hmm.
Think about mentorship and training. It's so much easier for senior employees to guide and support junior colleagues when they're in the same physical space.
Yeah.
There's a level of hands-on learning and knowledge transfer that can be really difficult to replicate remotely.
That makes sense. Like you can pick up on subtle cues, ask quick questions, get that immediate feedback that can be so valuable early in your career.
And let's not forget the social aspect.
Yeah.
For many people, the office is more than just a place to work. It's a place to connect with others, build relationships, and feel like part of a team.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of community and belonging is so important for employee morale and well-being.
I think you're right. As much as I enjoy working from home in my pajamas, there's something to be said for that social interaction, that feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself.
Absolutely. While virtual tools can definitely help bridge the gap, there's really no substitute for face-to-face interaction when it comes to building strong, meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
And those relationships, in turn, can lead to increased collaboration, creativity, overall job satisfaction.
So it seems like there are definitely benefits to both in-person and remote work. Maybe the real answer isn't one or the other, but finding a way to blend the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
It's about finding a model that maximizes both productivity and employee satisfaction. And that might look different for every company, every team, even every individual. The key is to be flexible and bold, adaptable, and willing to experiment to find what works best.
So if you were to sum up the future of work in one sentence, what would it be?
That's a tough one. But I'd say the future of work is all about choice, flexibility, and finding a balance that allows both individuals and organizations to thrive.
I like that. It's not about dictating where or how people work, but empowering them to find the environment that best suits their needs and allows them to do their best work.
Exactly. And it's about companies recognizing that their employees are their most valuable asset and creating a culture that supports their well-being and allows them to reach their full potential.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is this.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Whether you're an employee advocating for more flexibility or a company leader rethinking your workplace policies, be open to new ideas and approaches.
The future of work is what we make it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the future of work. We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking exploration of the trends shaping the world around us.